Derek, gonna do a screencast on d3js using a CSV file to build a stacked bar graph. So this is the outcome. This is the final code that I built for my website cacheflow.ca, cache C-A-C-H-E flow.ca. And frankly, I think it kicks ass. I think it's a pretty cool graphical representation of what would otherwise be just a normal data set. Here, what we're looking at is successful Kickstarter campaigns and what classification or what group, what domain actually receives the most money. Who has the most successful campaigns? The beauty of D3 is that you get object consistency. Now, what I mean by object consistency is that when you do this transition, each rectangle maintains its shape. The object is consistently shaped, if you will. So that when it moves, I mean, yeah, it's kind of a fun animation, which may otherwise just be a silly artifact. But in my opinion, this actually gives you some additional information. There's value in being able to see those things move and reorganize themselves as they're broken down, as you can see up here, based on the dollar value. So there's 2 or 3 hurdles that I needed to overcome. The first one was this legend, which we'll get to. The second one was the data type. So let me jump in here to the text editor and show you what I had to work with. I have a CSV file. This particular CSV separates things based on their category and the dollar value, which you were able to see in the actual visual. Now, how do we get from this to that? We do a whole lot of D3 code. So with D3, in order to import a CSV, you've got to do something like this. So we do d3.csv, we pass it our path to our file name, and then we assign it to this data, this object here. So the data manipulation actually takes place right here. I've gone and manually created an array of all of my headings. This is clearly suboptimal. You could do this programmatically, but I've chosen not to. I've created a variable called layers, and we see our first mention of the d3 layout.stack. Keep that in mind because that becomes really important when you're creating your data, which we find out 2 lines later. Is what we get is an object, or excuse me, what we're explicitly returning is an object that has an X and a Y. But when I reference the stack layout docs on d3.org, I know that my stack needs an X, a Y, and a Y0. So let's take a moment and think of how that maps to the visual space, because that goes a long way in figuring out what the code is going to do for us. So think of a stacked bar graph. Each block takes its own color, but also takes 2 distinct Y values. We need to know that we need to map the next block on top of the previous block, which kind of brings to light the necessity of those 2 individual Y values. But you'll notice in the code, we're explicitly returning an object with just an X and a Y. So where does that extra Y0 come from? The D3 layout.stack. Now, if you've never done a stack layout graph in D3 before, and you're like me, you will find this to be a significant hurdle. Understanding what this does, and of course leveraging the documentation, is key here. Prime example of why that might trip you up is we drop down a few lines here and we look at these 2 variables which calculate the maximum in that layers variable. So suddenly we get this Y0 referenced over here, and you might be thinking, what is the deal with that? Where did that come from? So I've console.log layers, and we can go and check that out. So if I come in here and refresh the page, we'll get an idea of what we have in terms of a return data set and how stack operates. So we've got an array, which contains an object, and our y0 value magically appears. Interesting. The key there, as mentioned, is knowing how that d3.layout.stack function actually works. Now, the secondary barrier that I had was in my legend. So you can see here, the legend takes two distinct data sets. So the blocks take colors, and the data takes text. This is clearly suboptimal. As mentioned earlier, I actually have an object. I actually have manually created this headers when that isn't always necessary, but in this particular example, that's how I did it. So in order to get inside headers and to reference the strings that you see here, we have to do a little bit of additional manipulation on that. So let me just expose what's going on in the web page here by inspecting the DOM properties of my text element. So our data is an array of all of these strings. And what I do is simply reference the index position of those strings to tag these appropriately. That's done here. So this particular code snippet looks like hell, and it is indeed confusing. So I want to go over it real quick. We pass the array headers in square brackets as an array, and we do some simple manipulation. This dot slice dot reverse is purely for aesthetics. I reverse the order, again, purely for aesthetics. You could alternatively, as was shown earlier, simply do that. Now, we needed our text to return our data and an index. This is the first implementation of J which I have seen, and that was a second major hangup. It prompted me to post this Stack Overflow question, which I'll reference real quick just to give you an idea of where I started. Simply taking my arrays and passing them in to the data, with the data function in D3. And I had a problem where the data was bound to the parent element. The G element was holding my strings. So I needed to correct that, and I did. I did so with the following. So using an array to pass in my headers array, binding the total array to each text object, then allows me to reference it with J. So still a little bit murky on how this all works. If you got some suggestions on how to improve this code or the code that is shared in the comments section, it's all up on GitHub. Feel free to refactor it. Feel free to improve it. Give me a shout at cacheflow.ca. That's C-A-C-H-E flow.ca. And let me know what you think of the graph as well as the blog posts. I think you'll find it interesting. So this is Derek from cacheflow.ca. Hope you enjoyed the tutorial on creating a D3 stack layout chart from a CSV, and have a great day.